Love, relations, and sex, these are sensitive subjects to many traditional cultures. Often they are not spoken about in public or public displays of affection are especially frowned upon. Perhaps some of us may also know that it is rare for family members to express love to each other in a Western fashion, such as saying I love you or through hugs. For a traditionally conservative culture such as China, this is because Confucian ideas have been a pillar of Chinese society since dynastic times. It would continue to be the dominant school of ethics and morality throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. With the prevalence of cinematics, representations, and visual media, the question became about how to portray intimacy and relationships to a traditionally conservative society. Perhaps some scenes may be seen as controversial, provocative, and simply unrelatable. Intimacy has many different dimensions. There are different expressions of love in filial or romantic relations and between friends or siblings. In our video, we will discuss the changing intensity of intimacy in romantic relationships between men and women, as portrayed in Chinese cinema throughout the decades. Such a study is valuable in understanding how modernization, politics, and sociocultural change have changed Chinese society, and more specifically, how relationships have been viewed in the public sphere throughout the time. We will examine the various portrayals of intimacy from the 1950s to current day. The reason we have chosen this time period and the following four films is due to the relevant context of pre-cultural revolution, period of modernization, and total modernity. Different political ideologies and states of society throughout Chinese history have affected how relationships are discussed in public visual media and, by extension, the private sphere as well. Since films are created to be relatable by the people of the time, it is safe for us to assume that each of the films can reflect private sentiments of the time. Our chosen films are White-Haired Girl, Between Tears and Smiles, Romance on Lushan Mountain, In the Mood for Love, and So Young. In particular, we will closely read and analyze the portrayals of intimacy in romantic relationships between men and women by examining their behavior and habits against the cultural and historical contexts. Relations in the films of 1950s and 60s reflected the strong conservative sentiments of the time. Society itself was shy to speak about relations explicitly, and on the screen, hardly any portrayals of what we considered intimacy could be seen. The influence of Confucianism was still quite strong, and the social situation reflected that marriages were largely arranged with practical purposes in mind, and men and women were not often seen dating. In The White-Haired Girl, the relationship between the two protagonists, Dachun and Xier, was subdued, and love was implicitly portrayed. The two characters are never shown to have physical contact. The two were seen exchanging gifts and singing to express feelings they had towards one another. Similarly, in Between Tears and Smiles, Jia Shu and Feng Xian are shown to read books together and exchanging photos as intimacy. Men and women partaking in exchange of arts, often associated with emotion and personal hobby. To display intimacy was probably more relatable to the Chinese audience, to whom explicit physical relations were not viewed favorably. After Cultural Revolution, watching films have become the mainstream public fashion. Romance on Lushan Mountain became one representative film of the 1980s. A shift in culture and society can be seen in the way Zhou and Genhua interact. There is a scene that Zhou kisses Genhua on his cheek. This is a decisive shift in how affection is shown on the screen. We can also see the two characters touching and laughing freely. Perhaps such a scene was considered flamboyant and excessively affectionate at the time. However, the reality was that the Confucian values were no longer as strong as they had been in the previous years. While they were still maintained to a degree, it is true that people were very slowly becoming more open to discussing ideas of love and intimacy, even if only in the scope of entertainment. This all drastically changed in the 21st century. The exposure to Western media, modernization of the state, and further deterioration of the traditional Confucian society means that the way relations and intimacy were thought of and shown in media adopted the explicit Western style. While only a few decades prior, we saw love films that showed no physical contact between the characters. In the mood for love and so young, physical contact is present, and sexual relations are strongly hinted at. In other contemporary films, you will often see the subject matter being sexually explicit and amorous in nature. While some of the older generation may feel as if such films are lewd and inappropriate, the exposure to Western media and loosening of traditional views have made such films acceptable and enjoyed by the general public. The way intimacy is perceived throughout Chinese society is often reflected through media and films. Through a close reading of several films throughout the decades and the social historical context of the time, we can observe how society's perception of intimacy has changed with time. Grounded in strong Confucian ideas, Chinese society had not always been as welcome to seeing intimacy and romance portrayed on the screen, such as in Western media. This is due to the specific cultural life script that had been presented at the time. It influenced the way life and relations were represented in films. Individualistic interpretations of intimacy were not explicitly present, and thus remained a topic that was rarely spoken of amongst the population. Leading into the 21st century, portrayals of intimacy are much more common and often the focus of the films. The cultural life script has changed due to various social cultural factors and the modernization of the state. The slight deterioration of traditional values and distance from the older generation has led the modern Chinese society to be more accepting of intimacy in the public sphere.